Now, I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. Carol Fishman Cohen is the CEO and co-founder of iRelaunch. As a career reentry firm, iRelaunch runs the iRelaunch Return to Work conferences, works with over 100 employers on building and expanding their in-house return to work programs, and leads a community of over 86,000 relaunchers. Now, iRelaunch co-leads the STEM Reentry Task Force with the Society of Women Engineers, involving 32 corporate giants across a range of industry sectors. More than 600 relaunchers have participated in task force companies' return to work programs, and over 80% of those have been hired. Now, Carol's TED Talk entitled How to Get Back to Work After a Career Break has over 3.5 million views and has been translated into 30 languages. And she writes regularly for the Harvard Business Review on career reentry topics. Cohen is a relauncher herself, having returned to work as a financial analyst at an investment firm after an 11-year career break. And as a graduate of Pomona College and the Harvard Business School, Carol splits her time between Greater Boston and Metro Miami. So welcome, Carol. I'm so excited to get to speak with you today. Now, before we dive into the question at hand, I want to hear from you about what you have to say about this very timely topic. Can you explain to us, especially for people that might not be familiar, the purpose of these career reentry programs and how they generally work?
Sure. Hi, Meg, and hi, everyone. And just an update, we have almost 100,000 people in our community now and are working with over 250 clients. So update on those numbers. I should have done that.
But thank you. Thanks for updating us.
But to start off, we're talking about the pandemic impact on career relaunches and on employer career reentry programs. So what these programs are at employers are programs that are directed specifically at people who have elected to take a career break from 1 to over 20 years for a whole range of reasons. Many of these programs involve an internship-like experience. So some people might have heard them referred to as returnships, where people are in for a certain number of weeks and then potentially convert to an employee after that returnship experience. And then there are other career reentry programs at employers that don't have the internship, but you're hired as an employee from day one. But the idea is that, and this is very momentous in our world, is that the career break, which used to be a reason to throw the resume out, is now required. It's required in order to be eligible to apply for and participate in these programs. So you have to have a career break in order to participate. And that's a really important point. And we'll get into how to identify people who have career breaks and people who are thinking about taking career breaks or on them, how to make sure that you are identified as someone who has a career break if you're applying to one of these programs.
Thank you. Thank you so much for specifying that. And you're right, this is something that you kind of hear about all of these programs that are only for this group of people or only for that group of people. Or like you said, you have that career break and all of a sudden it's like your resume goes nowhere. So thank you so much for calling out, kind of the different ways that these programs can look. Let's talk about the pandemic. Now, There were many people that withdrew from the workforce during it. We know large amounts of those were women, especially Black women, brown women, people who from underserved and historically marginalized communities. And also it obviously affects people that were on a career break pre-pandemic. So what kind of effects have we seen to those people, people whose career break was extant pre-pandemic, and those who took a career break because of the pandemic?
Right. So let's first clarify what those two groups have in common. People who left during the pandemic, and at the height of the pandemic, about 2.3 million women had withdrawn from the labor force. We're not talking about jobs lost. That was almost double that number, but people who actually withdrew from the labor force and were no longer counted in the unemployed. So a very big group of women. And we've made some progress back now in terms of women being hired back, but that was at the peak. But whether people left during the pandemic or before, the common factor is that people who make this choice or sometimes it's not such a choice, it feels forced, but are usually doing it for reasons that have nothing to do with their work performance. It's usually an external factor. There's a childcare or elder care requirement. There's a health issue. All of a sudden, your spouse or partner gets an overseas assignment and you have to go with them and you can't work during that time. Maybe your military spouse. So different situations that are really separate from work performance. And that's one of the reasons that this pool, which has been hidden before this, is being discovered as a high caliber pool of talent.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the fact that, like we've said about a lot of different things in the last 2 years, the pandemic has highlighted a lot of problems. It has caused a lot of problems as well, but it's more highlighted, some of the inequities that were already existent in the workplace and in our kind of societal structures that we built around them. And we also had a really good question come in from, oh, sorry, go ahead. You speak first and then we'll go to
I just realized I didn't really finish answering your question. So I just wanted to highlight that many of these return to work programs, these employer formal career reentry programs, require a minimum of a 2-year career break. And during the pandemic, we saw at least 6 of them, big major employers like IBM and Amazon and MasterCard and TD, they lowered the minimum number of years of career break from 2 to 1, specifically because they saw more people leaving during COVID. And then Goldman Sachs even started a special COVID initiative for people who had left since March 2020 to come back in with some transitional support, but not the same level that they give their formal and long-running returnship program where people might have been out for much longer periods.
Okay, cool. And now we do have a question in the chat, and I don't know if this is kind of a question you can answer or not. Do you know why most companies had that 2-year like baseline requirement? Is there like, studies beyond that or reasons for it? Or is it sort of just like a subjective, somebody just picked it?
Well, the companies that have it, some point to official studies or just what they've observed or watching with other companies, that after the 2-year point, it becomes significantly harder. That becomes more of a barrier, that length of career break, than the shorter one that might be 0 to 2 years, or now even 0 to 1 year. However, we work directly with the people who are in these programs on, this is like the bread and butter of what we do. We're inside the companies. And I can tell you, the participants in these programs can have career breaks from 1 to over 20 years. We have plenty of people who have been out 5, 10, 15 years. So I'd say that, there's a perception that it is harder, and it is, but there are more and more of these programs that are seeking out people who have who have taken a career break. So that's important too.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's explore that a little bit. What other ways have you seen the pandemic really impact these return to work programs, as well as the experience of these relaunchers going through these programs or trying to go through it on their own?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you can imagine, just like with people who didn't take a career break, the employer career reentry programs that were running at the time of the pandemic, March 2020, went immediately virtual. So they changed the whole format. They went virtual just like everyone else. We did see programs launch during the pandemic, and they launched virtually. So the programs went to a virtual format. We actually heard from directly, and this was all over the world. It was pretty fascinating to see how consistent the experience was of relaunchers, no matter where around the world they were located. But those who took career breaks for childcare reasons found that the virtual relaunch was a gentler relaunch for their families. So as you can imagine, it used to be when mom or dad went back to work, they were up and out of the house as the same day that they relaunched their careers. But the virtual relaunch made this process a little more gradual. So even though they were working, and maybe if you're a kid, you're not supposed to come in or you have to be quiet, mom or dad are still around and visible. And then maybe step 2, a little later, they're going to start going into the office. So that was helpful for people who took the career break for childcare reasons. So of course, people take career breaks for a whole range of reasons. The other thing that was helpful for relaunchers is many people, employer career reentry program or not, have been deterred from returning because of the face time in the office requirement. And the idea that maybe they could work the equivalent of a full-time job as long as there was some flexibility in how and when that work got done. Well, before the pandemic, that was a much more difficult proposition than it is now. And so there are more roles now that are completely remote, and or have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days in the office, so they're going to, but there's this flexibility built in and this lack of a face time requirement that is something brand new and really, really good for relaunchers.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So something that I'm really excited to talk to you about, and we got to speak on a little bit when we first connected prior to today's call. I learned from you that LinkedIn made an announcement last week that's particularly relevant to those on a career break. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Meg, this is the most significant announcement that has been made in career reentry for years. So what the announcement is that LinkedIn came out last week with a career breaks category for their profile. And it is specifically so people can put in to prominently in their profile career break. And there's like 13 different reasons why you took the career break. That's all a drop-down menu. And then it's just like you're setting up a work experience, except you're talking about your career break. And you can talk about the experiences that were enriching during that career break. You can include volunteer work or recent or relevant coursework. Now, for employer career reentry programs, they define career break pretty loosely. So they're saying that even if you were a substitute teacher, or you had occasional consulting, or maybe you had a side job at Instacart to bring in a side income, but that had nothing to do with your primary career goals, that could be, for their purposes, included in the definition of career break. So whether you want to include those activities under the career break heading or separately below it, you do have this opportunity to essentially call out your break. And this is a campaign that at iRelaunch we just launched called #CallOutYourBreak. And it's because the employers want you to call out your break when they're recruiting for their career reentry programs. And that is because sometimes they miss really good people because someone misinterprets volunteer work for paid work and it looks like there's no career break. This way you identify having the career break, and the employers can even do a keyword search to identify all the people that have called out their career breaks as part of their LinkedIn profile. So not only is it great for that recruiting piece and the career reentry programs, but it's even more. There's a validation of the career break as part of a career path, because LinkedIn is the arbiter of career path profiling, and they have made this an official part of your career path now. So there's something even more significant because it's LinkedIn having intentionally set this up. And I actually have a podcast with Beth Ayenu, who is the engineering leader of the LinkedIn profile page. And we have an in-depth conversation about the new announcement and how it works and the background and what they were thinking. It's really great. So this is at iRelaunch.com, 321 iRelaunch, our podcast. It's one of the most recent podcasts. I think we just released it last week. It was a special edition. So that's what's going on with LinkedIn. Huge deal for all of us in career reentry world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I count myself among a lot of the people that had a change in their employment due to the pandemic. I had a mental health crisis and needed to take a step back. So I moved from full-time employment at the end of 2020 into freelance work. And I remember having this conversation with my husband because we were facing, I first experienced suicidal ideation for the first time. This was serious stuff. And I remember in the middle of all these conversations about like, okay, what do you need? What's best for your health, blah, blah, blah. We said to each other, like, oh God, well, at least I'll still have freelance work, so I won't have to show a break in my resume. And the idea that that was something we had to worry about at the time, when faced with something like, oh, I'm sorry, all of a sudden I'm having intrusive thoughts, is bonkers, right? Like, that's not something you should have to worry about when that's what you're going through. And that is a drop in the bucket compared to what a lot of people faced during the pandemic. So I mean, and even still now, there are still people that have made it this far. And because there's still basically no end in sight, they're still having to make those hard calls of like, well, childcare costs more than I'm bringing in, so I guess I'm going to have to leave my career on the sidelines for our family right now. So I can't tell you how excited something like this makes me, not only because it would have helped me, but it also is going to be so helpful to so many people that really, really, they need to be recognized for what's going on in their lives right now. I love that.
Yeah, Meg, first of all, I just want to thank you for calling that out in the most authentic way and talking about mental health and suicidal ideation. A lot of people aren't going there, and I think it's really helpful. So thank you for doing that. And secondly, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, I posted a lot about this LinkedIn announcement. So Carol Fishman Cohen, if you want to take a look. And one of the links goes through actual steps that it takes to set up the career breaks on your profile. And
Excellent.
One of the examples is a health issue career break, mental or physical health. And the example is a person who's taking a mental health career break. So I thought that was too.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like it's one of those things that you don't know about it until you talk about it, and more people can make it visible. Plus, I am very lucky to be in this position of privilege with not only, family and friends and healthcare workers that support me, but also big support from my company. And I know that not a lot of people are lucky enough to get that. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I like to share freely, mostly because other people need to hear that this is something that other people go through. So thank you for that acknowledgement. Now, when it comes to this feature with LinkedIn, what do you think that this means for future relaunchers? Do you think that it's a step forward, or do you think it's a step back in some ways? Like, how do you see this impacting future relaunchers down the road?
Well, at iRelaunch, we're all about normalizing career breaks. And I believe that the experience that we've gone through in the pandemic has taken us a giant step forward in normalizing the career break. There are so many more people who've taken them. Companies, recruiters are used to seeing them on resumes. So that is all, I think, a very positive thing. Now, with the additional move by LinkedIn to create this category, I think that's also a giant step forward in normalizing career breaks. The question is, people who are looking to return to work are not only looking at career reentry programs. They might be looking at more traditional jobs too. And so then the question becomes, how is the career break interpreted if it's really called out, if you're applying for a role that is not part of a career reentry program? Because before this, you might be advised, put in your volunteer work, put in your recent and relevant coursework, put in your occasional consulting, and put those in separate categories that sort of like are part of the time that you took it off, but don't actually call it a career break. Now, I called it a career break and a community leader break on my own, but that was a different situation. So I think that that's really what's left to be figured out is when people call out their career break, is that it's certainly going to help them be identified as eligible for the return to work programs at employers. Is it going to hurt them in applying for roles that don't require the career break? And I think we don't quite know yet. But when we're talking to employers are really interested in the context. What did you do during your career break? Why did you take it? What did you do during it? And how you can tell that story. And the reality is, people who are successful returning to work, not through career reentry programs, it actually holds for them too, but through more typical route, are really in the door because of a personal handoff, not because someone's recruited them and identified them off of a database or off of LinkedIn. So that's why that stress on networking is so important. And we're talking about, I'd also direct people to our podcast for this reason. I get into detail. I host it with the relaunchers on, well, what actually made the difference to help you get that job opportunity? And someone will say, well, you know what? My friend was talking to someone at church and then she thought I should meet that person. So it's like in the course of your daily life, having these conversations and interactions that a lot of this, quote, networking happens.
Yes, I love that. I love the idea of kind of not only recognizing that, people go out and try to, people make a concerted effort to network, and then there's all of that connection that happens somewhat organically, right? And not everybody is subject to that. Not everybody's in those rooms. I watched Hamilton for like the 1000th time over the weekend. So room where it happens is like echoing loudly in my brain right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right. So you mentioned this idea of, time will really tell how this is going to play out for people who are career relaunchers, but may not be like taking advantage of, or may not be a part of an explicitly specified reentry or returnship program. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what those programs might mean in the context of this great resignation, right? We're in the middle of, separate from what the housing market is doing right now, we're in the middle of basically a buyer's market. These companies are trying to sell you that they are a great place for you to be. But there's a lot of opportunity right now if you are a buyer, if you are a job seeker. So what do you think that these programs mean within that context?
Yeah, well, certainly we're seeing more and more of these programs get created, and by the big leading companies of the world across the all different business functions and different lines of business and geography. So we're seeing a big expansion of these programs. We're seeing the programs that have been already exist grow, so get bigger, and now they've been around longer. So there are more relaunchers inside these organizations than ever before. And we think that is also going to change because relaunchers who are inside a company are more open and interested in hiring relaunchers to work for them. And we're finally getting to the point where relaunchers have been inside the organization long enough that we're now hearing stories about relaunchers being managers in the return to work programs where new relaunchers are coming in. So that's really exciting. But so there's absolutely huge demand, and that's very helpful. But the one thing I just want to caution people about, because we hear this, whether the economy is a great economy for people who are returning to work, or whether it's a terrible economy, a recession. And that is the negative talk loop that you might hear yourself or you might hear from other people. If you're a relauncher and you're in a prolonged job search during a time of very low unemployment, when it's supposed to be a buyer's market and you are not employed yet, you have to filter out any negative talk that you might tell yourself or anyone else. It's like, well, what's wrong with that person? Why aren't they employed? And so
yes, thank you for calling this out.
Really important. And then, of course, in a tough economy, you might hear these comments. Oh, well, forget it. The economy's horrible. There are no jobs. There's no way you'll ever get hired. So either way, there's a difficult sort of emotional leap that you have to make there, and you have to persevere. And that's another reason I'm referring to this podcast, but it's another reason why it's really helpful to hear people talk about, I was in a pretty dark place. It was taking a long time, and I was feeling like, how is this ever going to happen? And how they persevered through the really toughest parts and then moved on. And when it took a long time, ultimately relaunched their careers. It's really inspiring and it's really instructive. But I just wanted to throw that into the mix. But overall, I think it's a very exciting time because we've never seen so much growth and so much interest in among employers to start career reentry programs. And I should add, we just had the first state career reentry program launch in the state of Utah. The state of Utah just launched Return Utah. They're now on their second cohort. We just had our employer summit last week where we gathered our whole employer community together, and we had Shay Baker, who's a relauncher herself, who was in the inaugural cohort of Return Utah and now runs the program, talking about that program. So we're going to see more activity of different types of employers that are starting to offer these programs as well.
Yeah, that's so fabulous. And thank you so much for calling out, like you said, the kind of negative self-talk that happens around that. Obviously I'm part and parcel to it as well. All right, so we have about 3 minutes left. I'm going to try and get to a couple of these questions. One of the things that I want to ask is for those of us, or for those people in the audience who've never taken a career break but are thinking about doing so, what should they consider beforehand?
Okay, I'm glad we were able to fit this in. So let me just focus on 3 things. First of all, eyes wide open, okay? There's something called the CAP calculator, and it's the Center for American Progress. It has a calculator that takes in all of your projected income and raises and Social Security and compounding and everything going forward. And you can actually put in your current salary and calculate for different numbers of years of career break, how much it's going to cost you to go on career break. So if I had had that tool, I was on an 11-year career break before I returned to my financial analysis job. If I had had that tool, I think I'd probably still go on career break because my company collapsed while I was on maternity leave and I didn't have anywhere else to go to. But I think I wouldn't have been out as long because of the lost combined income. So that's number 1, eyes wide open. Number 2, document. Right now, document all of the meaningful things that are happening in your work environment. It could be anything where you learn lessons, positive experience, negative experience, milestone experiences. Keep an e-file and keep writing it down, because later when you go on career break, your post-career break self is going to thank you for taking these notes, because you will be able to then recreate in specific anecdotes what you're doing right now, as opposed to try to remember it, years later. And then the other thing is, nurture your relationships right now, not only, of course, with your boss and people who are peers to you, but people who are junior to you. When I went back to work, it was someone who was junior to me, who had been moving up during the 11 years I was out of the workforce. He's the one who opened the door for me to go back to work again. So you never know where these junior people are going to be, and they can sometimes be in a position to open the door years later.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, we are almost out of time, but let's revisit some of the stuff that you've got going on and where people can follow you, where they can reach out. What do you want people to know before they leave?
Okay, so certainly LinkedIn, Carol Fishman Cohen. You'll see me be talking about the Call Out Your Break campaign. Take a look at that. We have some great links and information for you there. Go to iRelaunch.com, our website. And we have iRelaunch.com, an iRelaunch LinkedIn page, and we have an iRelaunch Facebook page, and we have a private Facebook group called the iRelaunch Return to Work Forum. So there's some resources for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. This has been wonderful. So happy to have spent the last half hour with you. And we're I'm really excited now to see where iRelaunch goes, and to see what impact all of these changes at LinkedIn have. So thank you so much for sharing this with us and spending time with us.
Thanks, Meg. Great interview. Thank you.